Cool. So welcome back to another Voices in Rewilding series. Today we're joined by Mike Blackmore. So to start off, do you mind telling us a bit about yourself?
Yeah, sure. I'm currently Director of Operations at Wessex Rivers Trust. So like a lot of rivers trusts, we cover all kinds of aspects of river health and try to look at that at a catchment scale. But my role is more really about river restoration, and I've got a small team, and we design and deliver river restoration projects mostly.
How do you see river restoration contributing to long-term climate resilience?
Yes. So when you think about it, the current way that we manage our floodplains is really badly suited to either ends of the extremes of rainfall, really. So if you've got floodplains that have essentially been modified and designed for drainage, then during drought conditions, obviously you're not retaining water in the floodplains, so that's really what you don't want to do. But also during very heavy rain, you're more likely to end up with flooding downstream if you're rapidly draining the floodplains. So if you've got a settlement downstream of a large catchment where you've got that kind of drainage based approach to hydrology, then all of that water is basically firing off downstream to where people live.
Yeah.
So river restoration is it's not just about the restoration of the channels themselves. So a lot of our channels have been very heavily modified to be, very good conduits of transporting water downstream in order to drain the floodplains, but actually start thinking about connection to those floodplains as well. So it's taking that kind of almost nowadays a whole valley approach to river restoration, and that's really, if we're going to survive what's potentially coming in terms of climate change, I would say that isn't just a nice to do, that's an absolute essential.
Yeah, it's becoming, less of a ideal thing to do and something that people are going to have to start doing in order to stop the floods.
Yeah, we're not going to have a choice on the matter. I think,
Yeah.
it's not about it just being something that's good to do for wildlife. It really is something that we're going to have to do if we're going to adapt to climate change.
So do you think nature-based solutions can ever fully replace a traditional flood defense, such as, your flood embankments and your dams?
No. Short answer, no, it's not going to happen. What you can do is you can build back a natural level of resilience. So you can seek to undo the mistakes we've made in essentially reducing the resilience of our rivers and floodplains. But we have built in those floodplains, and to a certain extent, what climate change is doing just to sea level rise in this country, just what isostatic rebound is doing to sea level rise. The south of the country is sinking. That's been happening since the end of the last ice age. Add climate change to that, coastal areas are still going to be impacted, and the lower parts of our floodplains are still going to be vulnerable. So we're still going to need traditional engineered solutions to flooding. We're probably going to need more of them. But I think what we are going to have to transition towards is more kind of resilience measures at a more local scale, rather than thinking we can just build flood walls higher and higher and keep the river out. It's not going to happen. And obviously the more we can do to reconnect our floodplains upstream and give the rivers space to spill out and fill their floodplains in the way that they should do, then actually the less money will be pumping in to flood defense measures downstream.
So I think from the sounds of it, that sort of nature-based solutions isn't enough anymore. We do also need the the hard engineering and everything to prevent it as well.
I don't think it was ever. I don't think anyone ever thought it would be enough to
Mm,
just do this kind of upstream thinking approach, but certainly, you know, it it's the kind of thing that if you're not doing it, you're going to
mhm.
be spending a lot of money and energy trying to deal with it downstream. And really, it's the solution is you're going to have to do both.
Yeah. So, talking about people having to do flood defence themselves, what role do you think landowners should play in managing flood risk, and how do you think they can help to mitigate it?
I think it depends on where they are
Mhm.
and what kind of geology and soil type their land is on.
Yeah, of
But
course.
as a general rule of thumb, the more that landowners can make space for water, and that might be in terms of actually allowing flooding to happen, hopefully in a way that doesn't cause them real economic hardship, and the mechanisms to help incentivize and compensate landowners for doing that are getting better. That definitely helps. If they can look at more holistic hydrological restoration and actually starting to bring back some of our wetland habitats on their land,
Mhm.
then that will help to deal with, again, both ends of the kind of climate crisis. So that's going to provide resilience for high flows and low flows. If you've essentially got a big sponge on your land that can soak up water during intense rainfall, then it's not going to be shooting off downstream so quickly, but
Mhm.
also it's going to then trickle out of that sponge, that wetland, at a slower rate, which is going to provide some resilience to very dry conditions as well.
Yeah. So again, it definitely depends on where they are, the land they've got, and I guess as well which section of the river they've got, because everything needs different management to help prevent it.
Yeah, and it's important to consider that what you do and what will work in one part of the country doesn't necessarily apply to another. So,
Mm.
if, for example, down in my neck of the woods, we're really on solid chalk.
Hmm.
Well, pretty much every drop of rain that falls on the ground goes into the ground down here. So
Yeah.
actually, the sort of measures that you might be able to employ in a more kind of clay catchment where you've got a lot more overland flow might not work. And actually, a lot of the flooding we get down here is groundwater flooding. So
Hmm.
some of those kind of more usual NFM measures might not work, and you might need to actually think about other ways of dealing with it.
Yeah. So from your experience, what types of nature-based solutions tend to work for you, and why would you say these ones?
So generally, I would say to avoid kind of off the shelf sort of designs.
Okay.
So my view is always that we should be looking at what was done to render the hydrology kind of artificial and
Mm.
and to reduce its resilience and its natural functionality and undo whatever that was. So if you've got uh series of field drains that have been installed, then actually like you should look at like can we undo those field drains and block them up? Can we look
Hmm.
at ditch blocking? Does this ditch system need to be here? Is it actually doing more harm than good? Um, if you've got rivers and streams that are very disconnected from their floodplains and have got sort of big bunded banks, can you look to lower those banks and actually reconnect to the floodplain? Those sorts of measures are vastly more successful and will have a much bigger impact than sort of building leaky log dams through
Hmm.
a stream. That um, and if you are even if you are looking at those kind of interventions, I would say, well, have a look, have a think about what happens when a tree falls on its own and the
Mm.
sort of log jams that you get naturally, in nature and how they function. They don't function like vertical walls of logs across a stream. Now there are going to be situations where those more kind of artificial engineered type structures have a role. Often it comes down to, you know, what landowners or regulators will tolerate. But we are in danger, I think, of following a path of, you know, standardized designs for these things, and it's not a one size fits all solution. But what does tend to fit all situations is that thought process of what do we need to undo to get back to something that functions more naturally, and that generally will give you a pretty strong result.
Yeah, so again, it's sort of you're trying to tailor each approach to the specific land you're on because it can't work for every, you know, different soil material or things like that.
Yeah, we need to do our detective work. You know, we need to
Definitely,
actually
yeah.
really understand the situation of where we are. What's the history of this catchment? What's been done to these water courses?
Mm,
What sort of geology are we sat on? What kind of soil type are we working with? How steep is it? Yeah, put all those things together, and generally you'll find it, you know, a solution should kind of rise to the surface that you can work with.
yeah.
You know, if you do that the right way, you're going to get probably a broader range of techniques to use. You might end up
Hmm.
actually coming up with something quite bespoke and unusual, but that will almost certainly give you a better result than saying, okay, we're going to go and build some leaky dams because we've heard of leaky dams and so have the regulators and they know what they are, and we'll get, you know, permission to put them in. I think we
Yeah,
need to be a bit more ambitious and a bit more imaginative in our solutions.
definitely. So how do you decide whether a natural flood management or a wilding project has been successful? And what sort of monitoring do you put in place to measure this?
Well, I mean, the ultimate test is do you see a reduction in flooding? So
Yeah.
we have had a project on the sort of edge of the New Forest where quite significant sort of nuisance flooding of a road, and a combination of winching over a load of trees into and across some old forestry ditches, and um, reconnecting the floodplain in a few places upstream. That meant that we saw quite a significant reduction
Hmm.
in flooding. And actually, to further monitor that, you know, there were, I think, a couple of different ways that was done in that case. The first phase was with depth loggers and collecting
Okay.
data and, you know, looking at the sort of hydrograph you get from it. But actually, what worked a lot better was setting up some camera traps and
Hmm.
just recording how much water went into the floodplain when we'd reconnected it. And I would say that if you are doing the sort of interventions that, you know, show up on a camera,
Hmm.
then you're probably doing something right. If you can only actually measure the signal of what you've done by putting in data loggers and plotting a graph, um, well, you've probably got to do that at a very big scale for that to make a difference. So
Yeah.
I would say that, you know, if you're designing something that is going to make such a big difference that you could just capture the difference in a photograph and it's going to tell you a lot, you're probably, you know, looking at a more effective solution.
Mm. That could be quite an effective technique, is literally just visually looking at something and going, we can see a clear, you know, difference between where we started and where we're at now. So it was successful.
Yeah, yeah, and I think in one case we just walked around the edge of the area that had been reconnected
Mm.
with some GIS tools, and, you know, you end up with a polygon that shows, you know, that gives you exact area of how much
Yeah.
floodplain you've connected, and then you take a couple of spot measurements of the depth of the water when it does, and you can actually work out what volume of water is now being held in the floodplain rather than going downstream. And again, you know, it's not as off the shelf and standardized
Hmm.
as, you know, plotting a hydrograph, but it's actually, it tells you an awful lot And it's a lot more useful for engaging with people as well. You know, being able to show
Yeah.
someone, look at this big area of floodplain upstream of you that's now intercepting this water before it gets to you, rather than saying, well, I've plotted it on a graph, and according to my graph, we've delayed the flow by an hour and a half. You know,
Yeah.
what's gonna engage with people better, you know? So I'm all for, of course, we do need to monitor these sort of interventions, but I think that the science is pretty straight cut on it. You know, it's not a complicated thing that we're doing. You know,
Mm.
we're trying to slow the flow. We're trying to restore natural hydrology. If we can see that that's what we're doing, then of course it's going to have an effect. And actually, I think we don't want to get too bogged down into how much of an effect, because at the end of the day, real engineered flood defenses downstream are still going to be part of any solution. And
Yeah, of
actually
course.
trying to get something accurately measurable when we're talking about restoring natural hydrology at a catchment scale, it's a very, very difficult thing to do. And I think we need to really have a bit more faith that it's the right thing to do, that it's just logical.
Hmm.
And really, we want to be measuring how much of it are we doing, and is what we're doing actually working, in the sense that, you know, if we're trying to reconnect floodplains, are we seeing them being reconnected? You know, those really much more basic visual um, representations of what we're doing. I just think it's more powerful, you know. And there's going
Yeah.
to be plenty of people that disagree with me because they want to see the hard science, but
There
you
always will
know.
be, though, unfortunately. Always
Yeah,
will
yeah,
be.
of course there will, of course there will. And, you
Yeah.
know, I'm very much at the I suppose the practical scale, you know, end of the scale for this kind of work. So, you know, I'm not an academic. I'm a guy that tells diggers where to go. You know,
And so, what do you think is the biggest barrier from stopping people using nature-based solutions a bit more commonly?
I would say it's probably certainty, because it's not a
Mhm.
certain outcome. You know,
Yeah.
we're anything that's nature based is inherently a bit more chaotic
Hmm.
and and unpredictable, and people like dams and flood walls and hard engineered structures. Makes them feel safe, whereas, you know, something that's scruffy and more natural and more dynamic and is
Mm.
going to introduce change that we can't accurately predict uh, in a way that would make most people feel comfortable. Yeah, that is definitely a barrier. And I think it's also the fact that what we are normally proposing, um, if you're doing this at any kind of scale, is is quite a significant change. It's a change to how the land is used. It's a change to how our landscapes look.
Hmm.
And people are very, very protective of landscapes. You know,
Yeah.
the in England especially, you know, we're a very, very nature depleted country. Our landscape is essentially a kind of scarred green desert, really, with a few pockets of um, a few oases of nature scattered about it. But it's so ingrained in the kind of um, public psyche that it's a beautiful thing. That
Hmm.
actually our, you know, open green fields and hills are how they should be, and that they're part of our culture, and we need to preserve them. That's a difficult thing to overcome. You know,
Mm.
we are actually in lots of cases talking about trying to restore landscapes back to what they were beyond living memory.
Hmm.
So that can be quite a hard sell, and it requires a lot of people to agree and work in a joined up way, which we're getting better at. But I think traditionally we've not been great at in this country. You know, so we're trying to get people to embrace both the change of what they can see and the fact that what we want to do will itself change. So,
Yeah.
you know, people don't like change in this country. So we're it's a double whammy of that, really, and trying to get them around it. But the more of it we do, um, the more comfortable people will be with it, and we are
Yeah.
doing more of it than ever before. So I think that will get easier. I think we're starting to see momentum building now for these kind of things, and it's starting to become a bit more mainstream.
I think when they start to see the benefits of it as well, they might realize that actually it's quite a trustworthy thing, and that actually there is some really good side effects to it.
Yeah, absolutely. It's those multi benefits. I think that's
Yeah,
that's a
exactly.
that's a really powerful part of this. That you can build flood walls in a city, and
Mm.
they might provide some quite good local flood defense, but they're not
Mhm.
providing anything else. In fact, they're probably denuding nature in other
Yeah.
ways. I mean, almost certainly there are very few flood relief schemes that don't have to be quite severely managed. They're the sort of that where the amount of trees you can have around the river, let alone falling into it, has to be quite controlled, and so the habitat isn't as good as it can be. Whereas a lot of nature-based solutions come with all kinds of great habitat benefits, and that is definitely something that people are starting to understand and appreciate now.
Yeah, and that's really good. Looking forward that they are, as you said, starting to look and appreciate it. And so, what additional benefits do you normally see alongside risk reduction?
Well, I mean, if you're going to make your floodplains wetter again,
Mhm.
then you're changing the physical conditions for life, basically. So you're
Yeah.
you're 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 significantly altering that habitat. So if you re-wet a floodplain, you'll start to see the plant community change. With that, you'll start to see the wildlife around it change. The invertebrates will change. You'll start to see a restoration of habitat for amphibians and different types of birds, and all the way sort of through the food web, really. Um, so biodiversity is very, very linked to physical diversity,
Hmm.
and where we've lost so much wetland habitat in this country, anywhere we bring that back, even in small pockets, even when you are talking about these relatively small kind of leaky dam schemes, you'll still get a pocket of quite significantly altered habitat, and that diversity is tracked. It correlates very, very strongly with biodiversity. It's
Yeah.
what we call niches for species. So that's one of the biggest ones, and then obviously you are seeing the the benefits at reducing flood risk, but with almost any kind of nature-based NFN type scheme, you'll get the other end of the scale. So that drought resilience will
Hmm.
kick in as well. Because, like I said, if you're creating a sponge which is going to drain more slowly, um, then that sponge is filling up during flood events, but then it's retaining water during
Mm.
very, very dry periods, and helps to actually build some of that climate resilience in.
I think that's something that's really good about them is that there's more than one benefit to it. So as opposed
Yeah.
to potentially a hard engineering approach, which is simply just flood defense. With this sort of approach, you get the habitats like you were saying, and other improvements which can really help out.
Yeah, yeah, and again, this is why we need to be thinking about restoring natural hydrology rather than just
Mm.
thinking this is a natural, flood management
Yeah.
project, because actually all we're really doing is returning the natural resilience of our catchments
Mm.
that we've in the past, previous generations, for all kinds of reasons, we've seriously denuded that, and um, by bringing that back, we bring back all kinds of benefits. And so, flood management is really just one of them. And yes, if you can target a project around flood management, but if whatever it is you're planning to do, again, is really based around restoring the natural hydrology of the catchment, or the stream where you're working, then you're going to get all kinds of benefits.
Mm. So how would you balance flood risk reduction with biodiversity and habitat restoration goals?
Um, well, I personally, I wouldn't necessarily place heavier weighting on the flood risk reduction, to be
Hmm.
honest. Appreciate often with these sort of projects, it depends on what the local drivers are, and then that
Mm.
probably links to where the funding is coming from, and so that tends to be the driver for what you're trying to achieve. So, for example, there are plenty of river restoration projects that are just about river restoration for river restoration's sake, and they will deliver flood management
Yeah,
improvements, or you can have flood management improvements that will deliver other biodiversity and habitat benefits. I think it, like I've already said, it should really be focused on, in either case, looking at what was done historically
hmm,
that is now causing you problems, and just undoing that. And
yeah,
yes, that can be packaged up as a flood management project. It can be packaged up as a habitat project. It really depends. But I don't think we need to necessarily think of it as something we have to balance. We should be just doing what's right and just undoing those harms, and then the benefits that come from it come from it.
yeah,
Um,
definitely.
yeah.
So, final question for you. If you were to give one piece of advice to someone starting out in the industry, what would be that advice you gave them?
Ooh, it's hard to say. The industry is changing so quickly. Um,
Yeah.
in the past, there were very few jobs, and I would say to people, volunteer, go out,
Hmm.
get some experience under your belts, so that when you apply for those jobs that come up, you've got the best chance possible. There's there's a loads more jobs now. It's a growing sector, which is great. So maybe I would say to people now, um, have a look at what kind of practical qualifications you might get under your belt. So
Hmm.
um, you see lots of people coming in at an entry level role that will have a degree, and in lots of cases now have a master's degree. But actually, how many people have got outdoor first aid qualifications? How many people have got a e uh, licenses or training for different um, ecology
Mm.
sort of licenses and things? Um, Certain tools, that, for the work that we do. Someone with a chainsaw qualification is very useful, or a some sort of design or construction health and safety qualification. That's
Hmm.
where I'd be looking now. It's gone from being just get some experience under your belt to I think sort of actually what qualifications can you get under your belt that actually broaden your options, because I think we're
Mm.
starting to move into a bit of a seller's market for labor now. I think we're not too far off where people there's going to be so many people looking for good young graduates or people just looking to get into the sector, that actually you might better start saying, well, what have I got under my belt and where would I like to go?
Yeah.
Wouldn't that be a change?
I think that could be good for any industry, really. Is it's great to have all the theory and everything, but showing that you've got the practical skills which can be put into practice in the job, like you were saying, is something that's really crucial. And
Yeah.
then being able to back it up with, the extra qualifications and things can obviously all work together to give you a good head start.
Yeah, there's only so much you can learn in a classroom. If you're going to be
Of
going
course.
doing things with rivers,
Hmm.
then the best place to learn is out in the river. So
It's a very
uh,
practical industry, isn't it? So,
it
getting the
is, yeah.
experience is
And
crucial.
even people that are just looking at a more kind of pure consultancy role,
Hmm.
actually the designing of these sort of projects, even if it's done completely sat at a computer, if it's done by someone that's been out and actually physically worked on delivering these kind of projects, they're going to design better projects.
Of course, yeah. They've had first-time experience seeing it all, so they can, link it back to further projects.
Yeah, absolutely.
Perfect. Well, it's been great to speak to you.